Well, welcome to the chat session and particular notes on, and today we're going to be talking about notes on Cornelius Van Til and his contributions to theology. And I have the privilege of speaking to two of my favorite people today. One, as always, is my dear friend Ross Hoagland, who is a partner in crime with me, talking about all things theological, and then a dear old friend from Westminster. I have two things on Lane Tipton that he can never beat me on, and that is I got my PhD before him. I walked across the stage, and he about 3 minutes later walked across the stage and got his PhD. And unfortunately, I've been trying to catch up with him ever since. And then other thing about Lane Tipton that may be the most important thing is he is an amazing connoisseur of 80s rock music. And one night at a bar, I tried to stump him. I quoted song after song. And if you go between 1975 and 1990, 1992, Lane knows any song that was playing on the radio during those years. And I stumped him on one. And I still every now and then raise this point.
I remember it. I remember the one that
just to gloat over him. But I am so excited. Lane Tipton is a pastor. He's a theologian at the Reformed Forum. He is a former professor at Westminster Theological Seminary. And I'm going to embarrass him when I say this. Besides the fact that his most important attribute, he's a father and a great husband. Has how many children do you have? You have three beautiful children? Four beautiful children. I'm looking at your library now, Lane, and I do remember your oldest girl. She had this trick because you had a rule when she was a toddler not to touch your books. And so she would go into your office and touch each book and say, no, 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 no.
So true.
And I don't know if you've ever trained that out of her, if she's still as devilish as she's always been. But the other attribute of Lane that I want to just share with the audience is I think Lane Tipton, and this will embarrass him, is the greatest living expositor and defender of the thought of Cornelius Van Til. So it is a huge honor to have him on. And Ross, you're just going to have a great time with this guy because he knows his stuff. So welcome, Lane.
Thank you. I have to. I appreciate it. That is embarrassing. It's not true, but you're very kind. And thank you, brothers, for having me on. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, let's do the book. Here's Lane's book, The Trinitarian Theology of Cornelius Van Til, and I am working my way through it. I think I got to page 70 before we did this, and thank you. It's a great book. I'm really, really enjoying it because I don't get this deep into this kind of thing very often, so it's been a real education for me. And I guess why don't you tell us who Cornelius Van Til was, and out of all the people you could have said the Trinitarian theology of a whole lot of people. Why did you pick Van Til?
I don't want to plug Reformed Forum, but I
Please
do have
and incidentally, we will put a link to Reformed Forum on there.
Oh, that's wonderful. If you do, great. If you don't, that's not why I'm here, as you brothers know. But I have an introduction to Van Til's life and theology in a free course that's offered there. It's been up for a couple of years. And Van Til, you can reference for a lot more, historical, biographical, publication details. But Van Til stands out as one of the most important Reformed theologians and apologists of the 20th century, uniquely influenced by the theology of the Continental Dutch, Bavinck and Kuyper especially, and the English Puritan tradition as received at Princeton. He studied under Gerhardus Voss, who was his favorite professor, and received the confessional theology of Old Princeton and taught at Westminster Theological Seminary basically from its founding until his retirement. He died in 1987, and the Festschrift for him was written in 71, retired soon after. And he stands out as a an influential, but I take him to be misunderstood theologian in the 20th century, now extending into the 21st century. And I think the reason I wanted to write on him, Ross, is that the work of former great Vantillians, I think the best Vantillian of the previous generation by an incredibly wide margin was Greg Bahnsen. Bahnsen wrote on method primarily. Other Vantillians who spent time writing directly on Van Til, one stands out. That's John Frame, who wrote Van Til, an analysis of his thought. But that's a kind of scattershot or shotgun approach with various topics being brought in. And no one had done, until I published this volume, no one had written a sustained account of how Van Til himself says the ontological trinity is the interpretive concept everywhere and regulates our theology of the creator creature relation, our understanding of Adam as the image of God, the covenant of works, the doctrine of scripture, the person and work of Christ, the application of redemption, and the method of defending the faith in light of that reformed system of thought. So I thought that it would be useful if I tried to present the totalizing approach of Van Til, organized the way Van Til himself organized it, which is a movement from the theology of the Trinity all the way toward his apologetical method, which he believed was the direct fruit or fruition of a reformed, a self-conscious confessional reformed theology in the tradition of Old Amsterdam and Old Princeton, lengthened and extended by his own reflection.
Well, Lane, in all of that, our audience might not even understand or appreciate or even know anything about the history of American theology as it developed, let alone the Netherlands. So, what do you mean by Old Princeton? And kind of as a follow-up question, why was Westminster Theological Seminary founded?
Right. Well, Princeton was originally founded to train ministers of the gospel in what you might call the full-orbed Calvinism of the Westminster Standards. And 18th and 19th century, it was strong in that regard, had theologians such as B.B. Warfield, Charles Hodge, Gerhardus Voss teaching there. And up until the turn of the 20th century, it was the bastion of intellectually rigorous confessional reformed theology over against modernist alternatives, the New Haven theology, which is Pelagian, broader non-confessional fundamentalism, and a host of other theological options, Lutheran, Baptist, etc. And at the time, at the turn of the 20th century, its board was reorganized, and Van Til was studying there. Machen and Voss were teaching there, and the board was reorganized in the early portion of the 20th century. 24 in particular is a big year, and it was reorganized and populated with modernists, modernists and moderates who would tolerate modernism. All modernism is unbelief. It's a denial of the authority of the scripture, the resurrection, bodily resurrection of Christ, original sin, imputation of righteousness, visible bodily coming of Jesus. In other words, it was overrun by unbelief.
And even in many cases, just the very existence of God. I mean, many modernists would say, beyond all of that, we don't even think that there is a God, or at least a theistic God who exists, let alone an inspired Bible.
Schleiermacher said that God is the ideal humanity of Jesus, in essence. So it's a different religion, as Machen wrote, Christianity and Liberalism to Counter It. Well, Westminster Seminary, which I now call that group, I call Old Westminster, because the new our 21st century expression of it has so far departed from that original faculty. You can call it new versus old, but Old Westminster, represented by Machen, Van Til, Murray, Stonehouse, Young, and others, was committed to this robust, intellectually rigorous confessional Presbyterianism that was taught at Princeton, but had been rejected by the mainline PCUSA and by the seminary, Princeton Seminary. And no sooner was the seminary founded in 29 than the OPC was founded as the kind of ecclesial body where the professors at the seminary were teaching.
And OPC stands for
Orthodox Presbyterian Church. I almost wore my OPC hat. It's one of my favorites, but I didn't. And Van Til was given over his whole career, teaching career, to serving the OPC, preaching, teaching, and serving at the seminary, and was most basically a churchman. And John Meether has a wonderful biography on Van Til that really maps out the churchman that Van Til was and the love that he had for the church, even above the seminary, because if you're thinking Old Westminster, not the new, but at Old Westminster, the seminary is the servant of the church. It's not a thing in itself. It's not for self-promotion. It's not to harbor and incubate heresy or error or hide mischief and ethical malfeasance and so on. It was a place for serving the Church of Jesus Christ in a way that was open, transparent, honest, and reformed.
And to back up your point, Van Til was a pastor when he was called to Westminster.
Yes, he was.
And how many times did Machen, Jake Rustin Machen, the founder of the seminary, how many times did he have to go to him and ask him?
Danny Olinger has the better take on this than I do, but I know it was multiple times. I believe it was he had to take. I believe it was Stonehouse, possibly Young, maybe it was Young, with him in order to prevail on Van Til. Van Til was wanted to be a pastor and really was brought to Westminster kind of kicking and screaming, as it were. Yeah. And that tells you something about how much he loved the church.
Yeah. I wanted to bring that out just to illustrate the point. Now, you mentioned Voss and you mentioned Bavinck. These were some of his major influences. Could you say a little bit about these men and why Van Til held them in such high regard?
Yeah. Let me say this. Gerhardus Voss is known as the father of Reformed biblical theology. He developed the method of looking at the scriptures from the historical standpoint, as the Bible is a revelational record of the history of special revelation. And that revelation moves in progressive and organic epochs, from pre-fall covenant of works to post-fall covenant of grace, in ascending and developmental movements from promising Christ to the coming of Christ and his humiliation and exaltation. And Voss set that over against modernist alternatives in the history of special religions and really pioneered an advancement in Reformed biblical theology, was the father of it. At the same time, while just after, around the time Van Til was studying with him, Voss had already written what has now been published as a 5-volume Reformed Dogmatics. So he was a true double threat guy, as we would call him. He was a dogmatician of the highest order, biblical theologian of the highest order, unparalleled in my opinion, and was not that popular at Princeton. So Van Til and one of his classmates really almost had tutorials in all of the classes that Voss taught. So Van Til was basically discipled directly under Voss, a point that's come to light in the past few years. Bavinck, to be brief here, taught at Amsterdam, and
this is Herman Bavinck.
Yeah, Herman Bavinck, and has a tremendous, among other things, 4-volume Reformed Dogmatics that, in terms of its encyclopedic scope and interaction with wide-ranging theological and philosophical views, probably is unsurpassed. Voss is very deep and penetrating. Bavinck is more encyclopedic and is just stellar overall in my assessment. And Van Til was in correspondence with him, talking to him, as was Voss, and very much a reader of Bavinck in the Dutch. And so those two men represent really the refining and extending of Reformed confessional theology in the 20th century. Bavinck from a directly continental Dutch perspective, Voss starting Dutch, but winding up becoming a Presbyterian and advancing the theology of the Westminster Standards, especially its theology of covenant and eschatology. And Van Til is a kind of student of both. And when you understand that, you start to see him in an entirely different light. He's a receiver and integrator of those two great streams of Reformed theology in the 20th century. And that's why Old Westminster, if you understand it right, it's the crossing of two streams, the meeting of two streams of Reformed theology, the Continental Dutch, the English Puritan. And Van Til, I think, in a number of ways, stands out as perhaps the most self-conscious receiver and integrator of both, and sought to extend those insights. And so it's really quite wonderful. If you're interested in Reformed theology, Van Til stunningly has this kind of ecumenical and synthetic approach to things, which is often missed if you're not reading him in light of his own primary sources and the influences that were on him in his education and expressed in his published writings. Of which there are a lot.
Let me ask you a question. You, in your book and just in your talk there, you use the phrase Reformed theology quite a bit. Do you mean by that any conservative, biblically based theology, or is it narrower than that in the way that you're using it?
Yeah, boy, Ross, that's a great question. I would use confessional Reformed theology to distinguish Van Til and the Reformed tradition from at least three groups.
Okay, good.
There we go. Three groups. First would be the modernist and neo-modernists like Schleiermacher and Barth.
Sure.
That's a different religion. That's rooted in Pelagian theology and post-Kantian speculative philosophy. It's what Machen called liberalism and set it over against Christianity. It's for smart people who have thought themselves out of the faith.
Yeah.
And it's just that is, we are antithetically opposed to that. The second, there's a broad swatch of what I would call conservative evangelicals out there, consisting of fundamentalists, neo-fundamentalists, and I'll call them neo-evangelicals. Think Fuller Seminary in the 40s and 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And these are conservative evangelicals who believe in a small number of non-negotiables, call them fundamentals: inerrancy of Scripture, virgin birth of Christ, substitutionary atonement, bodily resurrection, visible second coming. But they're not grounded in the ecumenical creeds, nor do they subscribe to the Reformed confessions. And so I would call them biblicists, kind of my Bible in me, but boy, I'm not a liberal. I'll tell you that much. I don't like Schleiermacher and I don't like Barth, but I'm not so sure about what that creedal, confessional, Reformed theology is.
Yeah, that's the tradition I was raised in.
Oh, me too. Me too.
Yeah.
I grew up on the buckle of the Bible Belt in Amarillo, Texas, and Reformed theology. When I started reading about it, some people told me gently as they could, "You must be in a cult." And once I learned, I said, "Actually, you're closer to a cult because you're a biblicist and don't have any connection to the ancient creeds and Reformed confessions." Arminian dispensationalism is veering away from biblical teaching as summarized in those standards. So anyway, the Reformed confessional view would then stand over against those conservative evangelical biblicists. And then it would stand over against, I guess my final qualification, over against confessional Lutheran, over against confessional Reformed Baptist theology, 1689 type. And so it really is something that's deeply biblical, but robustly historical in its self-understanding, and embraces the very best of the creeds and confessions. And so I would call that view that I hold to a kind of Augustinian Calvinist confessionalism. of a
Lane,
Presbyterian sort.
Lane, just to kind of piggyback on this, and just I'd like to hear your comment. Gavin Wertland, who is a friend of Ross's, I've had some interchange with him. He has this wonderful YouTube channel called Truth Unites,
I've
and
seen this, I think.
he's recently responded to Cameron Battusi's fairly vocal and popular conversion to Catholicism.
Mm.
And one of the things that Gavin Wertland said, which was, I thought, a good point, a lot of Protestants go into a Catholic church or they read a Catholic theologian and they note how rich it is, and it is. But because they come out of the kind of biblicist tradition that you're articulating or talking about, they fail to appreciate the fact that the Protestants have a rich confessional ecclesial tradition as well. So I would just like you to maybe comment on that before I have a follow-up.
Oh, sure. I would say this, that the real debate between the Protestants and Roman Catholics is who's being consistently creedal in terms of the ancient ecumenical creeds. Who is the heir of Chalcedon and Augustine and the developing theology that flows out of that? And I think the answer is that you have two very different conceptions of the so-called great tradition. And I do think, I'll say this, I think the Reformed have in its best expressions, the Reformed have a highly developed and distinctive theology of Trinitarian processions, image of God, covenant of works, sin, covenant of grace, person and work of Christ, function of the sacraments, and beatitude that stands in numerous ways strongly over against Roman Catholic doctrines of participation and sacerdotal grace and so on. And so I think the more that we recognize that the Reformed aren't biblicists, we're not just trying to reinvent the truth of the scriptures and restate it totally apart from creeds and confessions on the one side, but we're not traditionalists who are affirming an independent tradition that has hegemony over scripture and leads you to say things like you are deified in the consummation by participating directly and without mediation in the essence of God.
Yeah.
That Bavinck calls that a melting union. So I'm with you, Travis, that the Reformed confessional alternative is a tertium quid, neither biblicist nor Roman Catholic. And I'll say one last thing, and I know we have time limits here, but that's something that I believe Reformed confessional theologians today need to remember, because no matter how much you want to retrieve ancient and medieval expressions of theology, you have to be able to turn around and show fundamentally from processions to beatitude why you're not Roman Catholic. And that is in short supply as far as I can see right now. And this book is, from one standpoint, addressing that.
You keep saying you're not a biblicist, and I think I want to say something, and maybe you can correct this. But a lot of people hear that and they might say, well, Lane Tipton doesn't like the Bible, or Lane Tipton doesn't believe in the Bible or something. And some theologians we respect in their book Against Van Til, Gerstner and Sproul and Lindsley said, and I think you would agree with this, I think Van Til would agree with this, we uphold being rational without being rationalist. We uphold being empirical without being empiricist. We could add that we uphold tradition without being traditionalist. And along those contrasts, we could just add, we affirm the full authority of Scripture, but that doesn't mean that we're biblicists. We believe in interpreting the Scripture within the confines of a confessional tradition, which we think can be defended biblically, to be sure.
Yes.
But nevertheless, so I may have spoken too much, but tell me.
No, I love that. And I'll just say this. One of the best tests of whether or not you're a biblicist is whether or not you're heterodox without even knowing it. I'll just give you one example. Contemporary biblicists today, even 21st century, will so cut against the grain of Roman Catholic traditionalism and go to the Bible, that when they read texts like you find in Genesis 3:9, God says to Adam and Eve, "Where are you?" There are some contemporary Reformed, even they claim to be Reformed theologians, who say, well, if we're going to deal with the Bible properly, when God asks a question, "Where are you?" He doesn't know the answer, because anytime in my Bible, if someone's asking a question, they need some information. And that is much closer to home than many would think.
Mhm.
But that kind of biblicism is the irony is almost invariably accompanying a robust biblicism, which is reading the Bible without understanding of and submission to the creeds and Reformed confessions normed by that Bible, being aware of the debates and issues. You wind up reproducing them unawares, and that's happened to a number of people. And I could cite examples. I've done it in other places.
Well, I think we're going to say those names maybe in our next time together. We'll be meeting next week for our another show on actually this more about your book. But as we're kind of winding down this particular half-hour show, could you name some high-end, say, people that maybe our audience may have heard of, who Van Til actually greatly influenced, and maybe people are not even aware of the kind of people that he influenced in his writing and thinking?
Yeah, Van Til really did influence a wide range of theologians. He influenced those who took his thought in the direction of Christian Reconstructionism. Rousas Rushdoony, Gary North, and Greg Bahnsen all understood themselves to be Van Tilians. They wanted to begin with his theology of um, revelation and the authority of the scriptures, and taking every thought captive, obedience to Christ. Uh, I think Van Til also influenced those who came to be known as expositors of Van Til in the 20th, and now a few continue into the 21st century. Vern Poitras, William Edgar, Scott Oliphant, John Frame were influenced by Van Til. I think you also have a number of men like who were probably the most robust Van Tilians I knew, the most full-orbed. Three stand out in no order, really. Meredith Kline dedicated the structure of biblical authority to Van Til. Richard Gaffin, deeply influenced by Van Til, one of the more vocal Van Tilians I've ever known. And Robert Strimple at Westminster, California, taught an apologetics class and was explicitly Van Tilian. And I guess I should add a fourth who was definitely self-consciously a Van Tilian. Edmund Clowney was very much a Van Tilian. I think there are others that I could name, but in that latter group, those are the men I was trained under in varying ways: Klein, Clowney, Strimple, and Gaffin. Those people were not of the theonomic and postmillennial variety, and they, like Van Til, were neither theonomic nor postmill, but covenant theologians, theologians of redemptive history, and all of them to a man amillennial. And I think that's part of a divide in those who claim to be Van Tilian, is that you have a small number. It might be growing again. It was really getting whittled down years ago, but the theonomic reconstructionist types are continuing to try to promote and develop things according to a Van Tilian view. And then the redemptive historical Vossian amillennials are also laying a fundamental claim to Van Til. And it makes for an interesting study in a series of contrasts between those who are wanting to affirm him.
My advisor at Dallas Theological Seminary was a Van Tilian, and he told me that Van Til was very much against young earth creationism. What is ironic is that a lot of the young earth creationists that we can name, like Ken Ham and Jason Lyle, very explicitly uphold the presuppositional apologetic of Van Til.
Yeah.
And I'll name one more name that was greatly influenced by him, but was more eclectic, and that's Francis Schaeffer. A lot of people might know him as a very famous apologist. And in fact, Hugh Ross, Ross and I have this friend, Hugh Ross, who started reason to believe, and his favorite presuppositionalist, he says, is Francis Schaeffer. Now, you and I know that I think Schaeffer's more eclectic, or maybe a combinationalist, a cumulative case person, if you will.
Yes.
But he was clearly influenced by Van Til.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this is going to have to be it for the week. But Lane, thank you for being with us, and for those of you that were interested in this discussion, next week we're going to talk about Van Til's view of the Trinity. So please join us then. Take care, y'all.
Thank you.